At 2:47 a.m., on the 37th floor of Chen Tower, Marc Sullivan heard something that would change two lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It wasn't the usual sounds of his security rounds, the hum of elevators, the distant traffic from downtown Seattle, or even the occasional late-night executive burning the midnight oil. This was different. This was the sound of a child crying, muffled but desperate, coming from behind the mahogany doors of the penthouse suite where 8-year-old Chen Tower lived with her billionaire mother. Marc had been working security at Chen Tower for 18 months, ever since he'd hung up his paramedic uniform and traded saving lives for steady paychecks with health insurance. His own 6-year-old son, Danny, needed stability more than Marc needed the adrenaline rush of emergency medicine. But in that moment, hearing Emma's frightened sobs echo through the marble hallway, every instinct from his former life kicked in. Someone needed help, and Marc Sullivan had never been able to walk away from that. What he discovered behind those doors that night would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, family, and the invisible barriers that separate one world from another. More importantly, it would reveal how sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from medicine or money, but from something as simple as a lullaby sung by someone who understands what it means to be afraid in the dark. Marc Sullivan had learned to measure his life in shifts. Day shift meant Danny was at Roosevelt Elementary, and Marc could catch up on sleep in their cramped Ballard apartment. Night shift meant walking the halls of Chen Tower while his son slept safely at Mrs. Rodriguez's place next door, dreaming of soccer practice and Saturday morning cartoons. It was a careful balance, this dance between single fatherhood and survival, but it was theirs. The tower itself was a monument to ambition, 42 stories of steel and glass piercing the Seattle skyline like a silver needle. Victoria Chen had built her tech empire from nothing, they said, transforming a small software company into a global corporation worth $8 billion. Marc had seen her exactly 3 times in his 18 months of employment, always clicking across the marble lobby in designer heels, always surrounded by an entourage of assistants and lawyers, always looking like she was late for something more important than wherever she currently was. He knew she had a daughter. Emma appeared in the company newsletter sometimes, usually at charity galas or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, always standing slightly behind her mother, always looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. But the penthouse was Victoria's domain, and Marc's security clearance ended at the 36th floor. Whatever happened in that rarefied air above the clouds was none of his business. That changed on a Tuesday night in October, when the elevator system experienced what the technicians would later call a cascade failure. 3 elevators were trapped between floors, and Marc found himself with emergency access to every level of the building, including the penthouse, while maintenance crews worked to restore normal operations. He was checking the fire exits on 37 when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be the ventilation system, a mechanical whine that needed attention. But as he moved closer to the penthouse entrance, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human. Someone was crying, and they were trying very hard to muffle the sound. Marc stood in the hallway, torn between protocol and instinct. His job description was clear about unauthorized access to private residences, but his instincts, honed by years of responding to emergency calls, told him that someone was in distress. The crying continued, punctuated by whispered words he couldn't quite make out. Marc knocked softly on the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the building was holding its breath. Marc waited, then knocked again, a little louder. A small voice, carefully controlled, answered from the other side. "Who is it?" "Security, miss. I heard someone crying. Is everything okay?" Another pause. Marc imagined the calculations happening behind that door, the 8-year-old mathematics of trust and fear. Finally, the voice came again, smaller now. "I had a bad dream." Marc felt something tighten in his chest. How many nights had he heard those same words from Danny, who still sometimes woke up calling for a mother who would never answer again? "Dreams can be scary," he said through the door. "Is your mom home?" "She's in Singapore. Or maybe Tokyo. I don't remember." The words hit Marc like a physical blow. An 8-year-old girl, alone in a penthouse fortress, crying from nightmares while her mother conducted business on the other side of the world. You thought about Danny, safe with Mrs. Rodriguez, but still within walking distance if he needed his father. This child might as well have been on Mars. "What's your name?" Marc asked, settling down to sit with his back against the door. "Emma Chen." "Hi, Emma. I'm Marc. I work security here in the building. I have a little boy, too, about your age. He gets nightmares sometimes." He heard movement on the other side of the door, like someone sliding down to mirror his position. When Emma spoke again, her voice was closer, as if she too was sitting against the door. "What do you do when he has nightmares?" Marc thought about all the nights he'd sat on Danny's bed, stroking his hair and humming the songs his wife used to sing. Songs that carried the memory of Sarah's voice, gentle and warm in the darkness of their old apartment. Songs that had become his responsibility when cancer had stolen her voice forever. "I sing to him," Marc said simply. "My wife used to sing lullabies, and after she died I had to learn them. Turns out I'm not a very good singer, but Daddy doesn't seem to mind." "Your wife died?" Emma's voice was very small now. "Yeah, 2 years ago. It's just me and Danny now." They sat in silence for a moment, two people separated by mahogany and marble, but connected by loss and the kind of loneliness that money couldn't fix. "Would you?" Emma began, then stopped. "Would you sing one of the songs, just so I know what they sound like?" Marc had sung those lullabies countless times in Danny's bedroom, but never in a hallway of a corporate tower, never through a door to a child he'd never met. But something in Emma's voice, the careful hope barely contained by politeness, made the decision easy. He began to sing softly, a gentle melody his wife had hummed during her pregnancy. Words about dreams and starlight and being safe until morning. His voice wasn't trained or polished, but it carried something more valuable than perfection. It carried love and memory and the promise that someone was listening in the dark. The silence that followed Marc's lullaby stretched for nearly a minute. He wondered if Emma had fallen asleep, if his voice had carried her back to whatever dreams waited on the other side of consciousness. Then he heard the soft click of a lock disengaging, and the penthouse door opened just wide enough for one brown eye to peer out at him. Emma Chen was smaller than he'd expected, her dark hair tangled from sleep, wearing pajamas that probably cost more than Marc's monthly rent. But it was her expression that caught him off guard, a mixture of curiosity and weariness that seemed far too mature for an 8-year-old face. She clutched a stuffed elephant to her chest, its purple fabric worn smooth in places from constant handling. "You're really a security guard?" she said, taking in his uniform, his radio, the badge clipped to his shirt pocket. "I really am. And you're really Emma Chen." She nodded solemnly, as if this were a weighty admission. "Are you going to tell my mom that I opened the door for a stranger?" The question revealed so much about her world that Mark felt his heart contract. Here was a child
who'd been taught to fear strangers, who'd been programmed to worry about her mother's reaction to every decision, but who was lonely enough to risk both for a few minutes of human connection. "I don't think your mom needs to know about our conversation," Mark said carefully. "But Emma, you know you shouldn't open doors for people you don't know, right?" "I know," she said, her voice small. "But you have a sad voice like me. And you said you have a little boy." "A sad voice like me." The phrase hit Mark like a diagnosis he hadn't realized he needed. In his 18 months of walking these halls, maintaining professional distance from the executives and their families, he'd forgotten that grief had a sound, a timbre that other wounded people could recognize across the space of strangers. "What's his name, your little boy?" "Danny. He's 6, almost 7. He starts first grade next month." Emma's face brightened slightly. "I'm starting third grade. I go to Northwest Academy. Do you know it?" Mark knew Northwest Academy the way he knew luxury cars and designer handbags, as symbols of a world where his paycheck would never gain him entry. Tuition there cost more than he made in a year, and that was before counting the donations expected for building funds and scholarship programs. "I've heard of it," he said diplomatically. "It's okay, I guess. The teachers are nice, but most of the kids there, their parents work all the time too, like my mom." She paused, studying his face. "Does Danny go to school near where you live?" "Roosevelt Elementary, in Ballard. It's a good school. Danny likes his teacher, Mrs. Patterson. She lets him help feed the class hamster." Emma's eyes widened with genuine interest. "They have a hamster? What's its name?" "Einstein. He's brown and white, and according to Danny, he's the smartest hamster in the entire world." This earned him a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, revealing glimpses of the child she might be if she weren't carrying the weight of so much adult worry. "I wanted a hamster, or a dog, but Mom says pets are too much responsibility, and we travel too much. Plus, she's allergic to most animals." They were still talking through the partially open door, Mark sitting in the hallway, Emma standing in the doorway clutching her elephant. It was an awkward arrangement, but Mark sensed that inviting himself in would shatter whatever fragile trust they'd built. "What's your elephant's name?" he asked. Emma looked down at the worn purple toy as if seeing it for the first time. "Mr. Peanuts. I've had him since I was little. Mom keeps saying I'm too old for stuffed animals, but..." She trailed off. "But some things are worth keeping, even when we grow up." She nodded earnestly. "Exactly. Did Danny keep anything from when he was little?" Mark thought about the small wooden train that still sat on Danny's nightstand, painted bright red and blue by Sarah during one of her good days between chemotherapy sessions. Danny didn't play with it anymore, but he'd never agreed to put it away either. "He has a train his mom made for him. He doesn't play with it much anymore, but it stays in his room. Because she's not here to make new things," Emma said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed about loss. "That's right." They fell into comfortable silence, two people who understood that some absences couldn't be filled, only carried. Mark found himself studying Emma's face, seeing past the expensive pajamas and perfect teeth to the loneliness that seemed to radiate from her like heat. "Emma," he said carefully, "how often do you have the nightmares?" Her face closed off slightly, the weariness returning. "I don't know. Sometimes." "Every night?" A longer pause. Then, barely audible, "Most nights." "How long have they been happening?" She shifted her weight, hugging Mr. Peanuts tighter. "Since the accident?" Mark felt his paramedic training kick in, the careful questioning that helped piece together what had happened when patients couldn't or wouldn't give a clear account. "What kind of accident, sweetheart?"
Looked up and down the hallway, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then stepped back and opened the door wider. For the first time, Mark could see into the penthouse proper, and the sight took his breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle, the city lights spreading out like scattered diamonds. The furnishings were museum quality, all clean lines and expensive materials, but the space felt cold, unlived in. "You can come in," Emma said, "just for a minute. The nannies are asleep in the guest wing, and they won't check on me until morning unless I call." Mark hesitated. Every protocol he'd been trained to follow screamed against entering a resident's private space, especially unsupervised, especially with a child. But Emma was already walking away from the door, assuming he would follow, and something about her trust made refusing seem like a betrayal. The penthouse was even more impressive inside, but also more unsettling. Despite its size, it felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. There were no family photos on the tables, no children's artwork on the refrigerator, no signs that this was a home rather than a very expensive hotel suite. Emma led him to a sitting area near the windows, where she curled up in a chair that dwarfed her small frame. Mark took the chair opposite, careful to maintain some distance while still being able to hear her if she spoke quietly. "6 months ago," Emma began, her voice taking on the careful cadence of someone who told the story before, probably to therapists and counselors. "Mom and I were driving back from a board meeting in Vancouver. She had to bring me because the nanny was sick and she couldn't reschedule." Mark nodded, not wanting to interrupt her flow. "It was raining really hard and Mom was on a conference call. She had the Bluetooth thing in her ear and she was talking about quarterly projections and market shares. I was in the back seat doing homework." Emma paused, her fingers working at the worn ears of Mr. Peanuts. "The truck ran the red light. Mom saw it just in time to swerve, but we hit the guardrail instead." The clinical way she described it suggested she'd recounted these events multiple times, probably to insurance investigators and medical professionals, but Mark could hear the fear underneath the practiced words. "Were you hurt?" "Concussion, some bruises. Mom broke her wrist and had to wear a cast for 8 weeks. She was more upset about missing meetings than about the cast." Emma's voice grew smaller. "But that's not the scary part." Mark waited, letting her take her time. "When the car was spinning, just before we hit the guardrail, Mom stopped talking about business. She started screaming my name, over and over, like she thought I was already gone. And her voice—" Emma struggled to find the words. "It was the most scared I'd ever heard anyone sound, even more scared than I was." The picture began to form in Mark's mind, a child witnessing her mother's terror, perhaps for the first time seeing past the carefully constructed facade of control to the vulnerable person beneath. For a child who'd probably never seen her mother show weakness, it would have been as traumatic as the accident itself. "She cried in the ambulance. Mom never cries. She says crying is unproductive and doesn't solve problems, but she was holding my hand and crying, and I realized that if something had happened to me, she wouldn't know how to keep going." Mark felt the familiar ache in his chest, remembering his own moments of terrifying clarity about how much he had to lose. "That must have been very frightening." Emma nodded. "But the worst part is that now, every night, I dream about that moment when she was screaming my name. In the dreams, I can't answer her. I try to tell her I'm okay, but no sound comes out. And she keeps screaming and screaming until I wake up." The clinical picture was becoming clearer. Emma wasn't just processing the trauma of a car accident, she was dealing with the realization that her mother, the one constant in her world, was just as fragile and frightened as everyone else. It was the kind of revelation that could shake a child's entire understanding of safety and security. "Have you told your mom about the dreams?" Emma shook her head. "She asks how I'm sleeping, but when I try to tell her about the nightmares, she gets this look on her face like she's in pain. Then she tells me that we're both fine now, and dwelling on the accident won't help anything. She bought me a new therapist and some melatonin gummies, but the dreams keep coming." Mark saw the impossible position Emma had been placed in. She was trying to protect her mother from the knowledge of her ongoing trauma while simultaneously dealing with that trauma alone. It was an emotional burden that would challenge an adult, let alone an 8-year-old. "The nannies are nice," Emma added as if reading his thoughts, "but they change every few months, and Mom tells them not to coddle me. She says I need to learn independence and resilience." Independence and resilience. Mark had heard those words before,
in the voices of parents who mistook emotional neglect for character building. Danny was learning independence too, but it came balanced with the security of knowing his father would always be there when he needed comfort. What happens when you wake up from the nightmares? I try to go back to sleep. Sometimes I turn on the TV or read until morning. The nannies aren't supposed to come to my room unless I press the emergency button, and that's only for real emergencies. And tonight? Emma looked embarrassed. Tonight was worse than usual. In the dream, the car kept spinning and Mom kept screaming, but this time I couldn't see her anymore, just her voice getting farther and farther away. When I woke up, I was crying so hard I couldn't stop. Marc felt a surge of protective anger towards Victoria Chen, this woman who'd built an empire but couldn't see that her daughter was drowning in the penthouse above the clouds. But anger wouldn't help Emma, and it certainly wouldn't help him understand how to navigate this situation. "Emma," he said gently, "when I sang that song earlier, did it help at all?" She nodded immediately. "It made me feel like someone was there, like I wasn't alone with the dream anymore." She paused, then looked directly at him with those serious brown eyes. "Will you sing it again, just so I can remember how it goes?" Marc glanced toward the windows, where the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Somewhere out there, Danny was sleeping safely in Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, probably dreaming about soccer practice and summer vacation. Here, 40 stories above the street, another child was asking for the same comfort his son took for granted. He began to sing again, the same gentle melody he'd hummed through the door, but this time he could see its effect. Emma's shoulders relaxed, her grip on Mr. Peanuts loosened, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked like what she was, a little girl who needed someone to chase away the monsters in the dark. When the song ended, Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that would change everything. "Marc, would you teach me the words, so maybe I could sing it to myself when the dreams come?" Teaching Emma the lullaby became Marc's unspoken mission over the following weeks. What had started as a single encounter through a locked door evolved into something neither of them had planned, a routine that bent around the edges of protocol and common sense. Every night during his rounds, Marc would pause outside the penthouse door and listen. More often than not, he'd hear the telltale sounds of restlessness, the shifting and turning of someone fighting sleep because sleep brought unwanted dreams. The security system worked in Marc's favor. The elevator malfunction had been traced to a software glitch that required ongoing monitoring, which gave him legitimate access to the upper floors. He'd started keeping a maintenance log, documenting his checks of the emergency systems, creating a paper trail that justified his presence near the penthouse.
Wasn't entirely dishonest, he told himself. He was maintaining something, just not what his supervisors expected. Emma had learned to listen for his footsteps, the particular rhythm of his security rounds. She'd taken to sitting by the door around the time she knew he'd arrive, sometimes humming fragments of the melody he'd taught her, sometimes just waiting in the quiet darkness for proof that she wasn't completely alone in the world. Their conversations grew longer and more personal as the nights passed. Marc found himself telling her about Danny's soccer games, about the time his son had tried to make pancakes and ended up covering half the kitchen in batter, about the elaborate bedtime stories they created together, featuring a superhero hamster named Einstein Jr. Emma reciprocated with carefully curated details about her own life, stories that revealed as much in their omissions as in their telling. She mentioned her tutors in passing, the way other children might mention friends, explaining how Mr. Peterson was teaching her advanced mathematics and how Ms. Liu was helping her practice violin, though she admitted she didn't particularly enjoy either subject. Her schedule was packed with enrichment activities designed to maximize her potential. But there was little room for the messiness of childhood, for making mistakes or discovering passions organically. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night, when Marc arrived for his rounds to find Emma sitting in the hallway outside the penthouse door. She was still in her pajamas,
but she'd wrapped herself in what looked like a cashmere throw from the living room. Mr. Peewatts sat beside her like a purple sentinel. "I couldn't stay inside tonight," she said by way of explanation. "The walls feel too close sometimes." Marc settled down beside her, noting how small she looked in the vast marble corridor. "Bad dream again?" She nodded, then leaned against the wall with a sigh that seemed too heavy for someone her age. "It's getting worse. In tonight's dream, I couldn't find Mom at all. I kept calling her name, but there was only echo." The progression concerned Marc. Emma's nightmares were evolving, becoming more complex and frightening as her subconscious mind processed not just the trauma of the accident, but the deeper fears about abandonment and loss that the experience had awakened. "Emma, have you thought about talking to your mom about this? Really talking, not just when she asks how you're sleeping." Emma pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself even smaller. "She's leaving for Hong Kong tomorrow. Another acquisition deal. She'll be gone for 2 weeks, maybe 3. The casual way she delivered this information made Marc's chest tighten. Here was a child processing trauma and abandonment fears while facing actual abandonment on a regular basis. Victoria Chen might be providing for her daughter's material needs, but she was failing spectacularly at providing the emotional security that Emma desperately required. Who takes care of you when she's gone? The night nannies stay over instead of going home, and there's always Mrs. Wong, the house manager. She makes sure I get to school and my lessons. I paused, then added quietly, "But they're not allowed to come to my room at night unless it's an emergency. Mom's rules." Marc thought about his own parenting philosophy, born from necessity and loss. When Sarah died, he'd learned that children needed different things at different times. Sometimes Danny needed independence and space to figure things out on his own, but sometimes, especially in the dark hours when fears seemed largest, he needed the absolute certainty that his father was nearby, that help was just a whisper away. What would happen if you pressed the emergency button after a nightmare? Emma considered this seriously. Mrs. Wong would come, and she'd want to know what the emergency was. When I told her it was just a bad dream, she'd probably give me some more milk and tell me to think happy thoughts. Then she'd have to write a report for
Mom about why I used the emergency system for something that wasn't really an emergency. The bureaucracy of Emma's emotional needs was staggering. Marc wondered how Victoria Chen could build a company worth billions while being so oblivious to her daughter's basic requirements for comfort and security. "Would you like to hear about what Danny does when he has nightmares?" Marc asked. Emma nodded eagerly, hungry for any insight into how other children navigated the landscape of fear and sleep. "He comes to my room. Sometimes he tries to be brave and handle it himself, but when the dreams are really bad, he just gets up and walks down the hall. He doesn't ask permission or worry about whether it's allowed. He just comes and gets in bed with me, and we talk about the dream until it loses its power to scare him." "He is allowed to do that?" "Of course he's allowed. He's 6 years old, and sometimes he's frightened. Being frightened doesn't mean he's weak or that he's failed at something. It just means he's human." Emma absorbed this information like someone learning about a foreign culture. In her world, emotional needs were scheduled and managed, treated as problems to be solved rather than natural aspects of being a child. "I wish I could do that," she said wistfully. "Just walk down the hall and have someone there." Marc felt the familiar surge of protective anger, but he pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't help Emma, and it certainly wouldn't change her mother's approach to parenting. What she needed was practical support, strategies for managing her fears within the constraints of her current situation. "Maybe we can't change the rules in your house," he said carefully, "but we can work with them. When you have a nightmare and you can't come find me, what if you had a way to feel like you weren't alone?" Emma looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" Marc pulled out his phone and showed her the voice memo app. "What if I recorded the lullaby for you? Then, when you wake up from a bad dream, you could listen to it and remember that someone cares about whether you're scared." Her face lit up with the first genuine excitement he'd seen from her. "You would do that?" Of course. But Emma, this has to be our secret, okay? Not because we're doing anything wrong, but because adults sometimes don't understand that children need different kinds of help than what they think they need. Emma understood the distinction between harmful secrets and necessary privacy. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Marc opened the voice memo app and began to sing, his voice echoing softly in the marble hallway. As he sang, he watched Emma's face relax, saw her shoulders drop as tension left her body. When he finished, he saved the recording and showed her how to find it on his phone. "Now you try," he said, handing her the device. Emma's voice was small and uncertain at first, but as she worked through the melody, Marc could hear her gaining confidence. She had a sweet, clear singing voice that reminded him of Sarah, though Emma's had a precision that suggested formal training. "That was beautiful," Marc said when she finished. "Your voice is much prettier than mine." Emma blushed with pleasure. "Mom hired a vocal coach, but we only work on classical pieces. She says popular music doesn't challenge my range." She paused, then added, "This is the first song I've ever learned that I actually wanted to sing." They spent the next hour practicing, with Emma recording several versions until she had one she was satisfied with. Marc showed her how to save the recordings to her own phone, which she'd brought from the penthouse. By the time they were finished, it was nearly 4 in the morning and Emma was yawning despite her excitement. "I should get you back inside."
Mrs. Rodriguez will be dropping Danny off at my apartment before school, and I need to be there when he wakes up. Emma's face fell slightly. "Of course, I forgot you have a real family to take care of." The word stung because it revealed how Emma viewed herself as somehow less real or deserving than Danny. Marc knelt down so they were at eye level. "Emma, listen to me. What we have here, these conversations, this friendship, it's real too. Just because your mom isn't here doesn't mean you don't matter. You matter to me, and you matter to Mr. Peanuts, and I guarantee you matter more to your mom than her business trips make it seem." Emma hugged her stuffed elephant tighter. "Then why does she leave so much?" It was the question Marc had been dreading, because the honest answer was too complex for an 8-year-old to fully understand. How could he explain that some adults used work as a shield against their own fears? That Victoria Chen might be so terrified of losing Emma that she'd convinced herself the best way to protect her was to build an impenetrable fortress of wealth and security around her. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about what's most important," he said finally. "They think that providing for someone means the same thing as being there for them. Your mom works so hard because she wants to make sure you have everything you need, but she might not realize that what you need most is just her." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Like how you gave up being a paramedic to take care of Danny?" The comparison caught Marc off guard. He'd never thought of his career change as a sacrifice, just as a necessary adjustment to new circumstances. But Emma was right. There were parallels between his situation and her mother's, though they'd chosen opposite solutions to the same problem of single parenthood. Something like that. But Emma, the difference is that Danny knows I chose him. He knows that everything I do is about making sure he feels loved and safe. You need to know that too. They returned to the penthouse together, Emma clutching her phone with its precious cargo of recorded lullabies. At the door, she turned to Marc with an expression of determined hope. "Marc, tomorrow night, after Mom leaves for Hong Kong, could you maybe stay a little longer? I want to practice the song more, and maybe you could tell me another story about Danny and Einstein the hamster." Marc felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had started as a simple act of kindness was becoming something more complex, a relationship that could have consequences he couldn't fully predict. But looking at Emma's face, seeing the first signs of genuine happiness he'd witnessed from her, he knew he couldn't walk away. "I'll be here, same time as always." As Emma disappeared into the penthouse, Marc stood in the hallway for a moment, contemplating what he'd gotten himself into. He was a security guard getting emotionally involved with the CEO's daughter, crossing professional boundaries that existed for good reasons. If Victoria Chen discovered their friendship, he could lose his job,
his health insurance, his ability to provide for Danny. But as he made his way down to the lower floors to complete his rounds, Marc found himself humming Emma's lullaby, and he realized that some risks were worth taking. Somewhere above him, a little girl was learning that she didn't have to face her nightmares alone. For now, that felt like enough. Victoria Chen's early return from Hong Kong shattered the fragile world Marc and Emma had built together like glass hitting concrete. Marc first learned about it from his supervisor, who mentioned in passing that Miss Chen had called from the airport at 6 in the morning, demanding extra security for an emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon. The deal in Hong Kong had collapsed spectacularly, costing the company nearly $200 million and threatening several other international partnerships. Marc felt his stomach drop as he realized what this meant.
Victoria would be home tonight, probably.
Stressed and looking for control wherever she could find it. If she discovered that her daughter had been spending her nights in hallway conversations with the security guard, there would be consequences that reached far beyond his own job security. He tried to warn Emma during his afternoon rounds, but the penthouse was bustling with activity. Mrs. Huang was directing a team of housekeepers in frantic preparation for Victoria's return, and Emma was trapped in what appeared to be an emergency tutoring session with 3 different instructors, presumably to make up for the time lost during her mother's extended absence. Through the partially open door, Marc caught a glimpse of Emma at the dining room table, surrounded by textbooks and worksheets, her face pale with exhaustion. She looked up just as he passed, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second. In that brief moment, he saw her fear, not just of her mother's return, but of losing the one relationship that had made her nights bearable. The confrontation came at 10:30 that evening, earlier than Marc's usual rounds, but perfectly timed to catch him emerging from the stairwell on the 37th floor. Victoria Chen stood in the hallway like a designer-clad sentinel, her black hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression carved from ice. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice carried the kind of authority that could silence boardrooms and intimidate competitors. "I'd like a word." Marc's mouth went dry, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, Miss Chen. Is there a security concern I should be aware of?" Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "Oh, there's definitely a security concern. It involves unauthorized access to private areas, inappropriate contact with residents, and a complete breach of professional boundaries." The words hit Marc like physical blows, each one precisely calculated to remind him of his place in the hierarchy. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time, for a chance to help Emma develop other coping mechanisms before their friendship was discovered. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to," he said, though they both knew it was a weak deflection. Victoria pulled out her phone and swiped through several screens before turning it toward him. Security camera footage played in grainy black and white, showing Marc and Emma sitting together in the hallway, her small form leaning against his larger one as they talked. The timestamp showed 3 nights ago, during one of their longer conversations. "My building has excellent security systems, Mr. Sullivan. Motion-activated cameras in every corridor, digital logs of every keycard access, audio pickup in common areas." Victoria's voice remained calm, conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than if she'd been shouting. "Would you like to know what those systems recorded over the past 6 weeks? Marc felt the walls closing in around him, but his concern wasn't for himself. "Miss Chen, I know how this looks, but I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why my 8-year-old daughter has been sneaking out of her room to meet with the night security guard? Can you explain why you've been entering my private residence without authorization? Can you explain why you think it's appropriate for a grown man to form secret relationships with children?" The implication in her last question made Marc's blood run cold. He'd been prepared for accusations of unprofessionalism, maybe even theft or corporate espionage. He hadn't been prepared for this, for having his motives twisted into something dark and predatory.
"It's not what you think," he said, his voice steady, despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Emma was having nightmares. She needed someone to talk to." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "My daughter has access to the best child psychologist money can buy. She has trained professionals to help with any issues she may be experiencing. She doesn't need comfort from the hired help." The dismissal stung, but Mark pressed on. "When was the last time you asked Emma about her dreams?"
Just whether she slept well, but what she sees when she closes her eyes? For just a moment, something flickered across Victoria's face, a crack in her perfect composure. But it disappeared so quickly, Mark wondered if he'd imagined it. "My daughter's medical care is none of your concern. Your job is to walk the halls and check the locks, not to play therapist with residents' children." Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. "Pack your things, Mr. Sullivan. You're fired. Security will escort you from the building, and if you attempt to contact my daughter in any way, I'll have you arrested for harassment." Mark felt his world tilting on its axis. Losing this job meant more than just financial hardship. It meant losing health insurance for Danny, losing the stability they'd finally found after Sarah's death. But worse than any of that was the knowledge that Emma would wake tomorrow night from her nightmares to find herself alone again, with no one who understood that sometimes children needed comfort more than they needed lessons in independence. "Miss Chen, please, let me at least say goodbye to her. Let me explain that I won't be here anymore so she doesn't think I abandoned her." Victoria's expression hardened even further. "You should have thought about that before you decided to manipulate a vulnerable child for whatever sick satisfaction you got from it." The accusation hit Mark like a physical blow. In all his years as a paramedic, he'd never faced anything as devastating as having his motives questioned when it came to caring for children. The suggestion that his friendship with Emma had been anything other than genuine concern made him feel physically ill. "That's not what this was," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I have a son, Miss Chen. I know what it's like when children are scared and alone. Emma needed someone to care about her nightmares, and you weren't here." "Don't you dare!" Victoria's composure finally cracked, revealing the fury beneath. "Don't you dare presume to judge my parenting. I work 18-hour days to build something that will secure my daughter's future. I travel the world to create opportunities that will benefit her for the rest of her life. Everything I do is for Emma. But what good is securing her future if she can't sleep through the night in the present?" Mark shot back, his own carefully maintained professional demeanor finally crumbling. "What's the point of building an empire if your daughter is so lonely she has to find comfort from strangers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at him with an expression of such cold fury that Mark actually took a step backward. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're done here. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you out. If you're still in this building in 10 minutes, I'll call the police and have you charged with trespassing." As if summoned by her words, the elevator doors opened to reveal two security guards Mark recognized from the day's shift. Their faces were carefully neutral, but he could see the discomfort in their eyes. They knew him, had worked alongside him for over a year, and this duty clearly wasn't sitting well with them. Mark looked past Victoria toward the penthouse door, hoping for some sign of Emma, some chance to let her know that their friendship had been real and meaningful, even if it was ending. But the hallway remained empty except for the 4 adults whose job it was to make sure he disappeared from Emma's life as cleanly and completely as possible. Mark walked toward the elevator with as much dignity as he could muster, the security guards flanking him like he was a criminal rather than someone who simply cared too much. As the elevator doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of Victoria Chen standing in the hallway.
her perfect posture and designer clothes unable to hide the fact that she was trembling. 37 floors below, Marc cleaned out his locker under the watchful eyes of his former colleagues. His personal belongings fit into a single cardboard box. A photo of Danny, a spare phone,
Charger, the coffee mug Sarah had given him during his paramedic days with "World's Best Dad" printed in fading letters. As he signed his termination papers, Marc thought about Emma waking up tomorrow night from another nightmare, reaching for her phone to listen to the lullaby recordings, only to find that the person who'd sung them was gone without explanation. The thought of her confusion and abandonment felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He drove home through the empty Seattle streets, past the gleaming towers of downtown toward the modest neighborhoods where people like him lived. In a few hours, Mrs. Rodriguez would drop Danny off for breakfast, and Marc would have to figure out how to explain that Daddy had lost his job again, that their carefully constructed stability was crumbling once more. But first, he had to figure out how to live with the knowledge that somewhere above the city lights, an 8-year-old girl was learning that even the people who promised to stay eventually disappeared. 3 weeks after losing his job, Marc found himself standing outside Roosevelt Elementary at pickup time, watching Danny race toward him with a gap-toothed grin that made everything worthwhile. His son had adjusted to their new routine with the resilience that children possessed, accepting Marc's explanation that sometimes grown-ups had to find new jobs to help families grow stronger. The call came that evening, while Marc was helping Danny with homework at their kitchen table. Mrs. Rodriguez had given them her old laptop, and Marc was teaching his son to type his spelling words when his phone rang with an unknown number. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Dr. Patricia Reeves from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about Emma Chen." Marc's blood turned to ice. "Is she hurt? What happened?" "She's physically fine, but she was brought to our emergency department 3 nights ago after what appeared to be a severe panic attack. Her mother mentioned that you might have insights into Emma's recent emotional state." The irony wasn't lost on Marc. Victoria Chen had destroyed his life for caring about her daughter, but now she was reaching out because that same daughter was falling apart without the support system she'd dismantled. "I haven't seen Emma in 3 weeks. Her mother made it clear I wasn't welcome in their lives." Dr. Reeves paused. "Mr. Sullivan, Emma has been asking for you specifically. She's told us about the lullabies, about your conversations. She seems to believe you're the only person who understands her nightmares." Marc closed his eyes, imagining Emma in a hospital bed, frightened and confused about why he'd disappeared without explanation. "What does her mother want from me?" "Miss Chen is requesting a meeting, tomorrow at 2 o'clock if you're available. Emma's treatment team believes your input could be valuable." The next afternoon, Marc walked into Seattle Children's Hospital feeling like he was entering enemy territory. Victoria Chen sat in the family consultation room, looking smaller than he remembered, her usual armor of designer clothes replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she gestured to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you after what I said." Marc remained standing. "How is she?" "The nightmares got worse after you left. She stopped eating regularly, started having panic attacks at school. 3 nights ago, she woke up screaming and couldn't breathe." Victoria's voice cracked. The paramedics said it was one of the worst pediatric anxiety episodes they'd seen. The image of Emma struggling to breathe, terrified and alone, hit Marc like a physical blow. "What did the doctor say?" "That she's processing abandonment trauma on top of everything else from the accident. Dr. Reeves says Emma feels like everyone she trusts eventually disappears." Victoria looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "She told the psychiatrist you promised you'd be there, and then you were just gone." Marc felt anger rising in his chest. "I didn't choose to leave, Miss Chen. You fired me and threatened to have me arrested if I tried to contact her." "I know." The words came out as barely a whisper. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Emma's pain filling the space between them. Finally, Victoria continued. "The night she was hospitalized,
I found recordings on her phone, lullabies in your voice. She'd been listening to them every night, trying to calm herself down from the nightmares. Tears started flowing down Victoria's cheeks. I realized that in 3 weeks, you'd given her more comfort than I'd provided in 8 years. Marc's anger began to soften, as he saw Victoria not as the Ice Queen CEO who'd destroyed his life, but as a terrified mother who'd made devastating mistakes. She just needed someone to listen. I called my own mother last night. First time in 5 years. Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue. I asked her what I was like when I had nightmares as a child. Do you know what she told me? Marc waited. She said, I used to sing myself to sleep. Made up songs about brave princesses and magical creatures that protected children from bad dreams. She said I had the most beautiful imagination until my father decided it was impractical and hired tutors to focus my mind on more useful subjects. The revelation painted a picture Marc was beginning to understand. Victoria hadn't always been cold and distant. Somewhere along the way, she'd learned to suppress her own emotional needs in pursuit of success, and she'd unconsciously done the same thing to Emma. Miss Chen, why am I here? Victoria took a shaky breath. Emma is asking to see you. Dr. Reeves thinks it might help her understand that you didn't abandon her by choice. And I'm hoping you might consider coming back to work for us, but in a different capacity. Marc raised an eyebrow. As what? Personal security for Emma. Someone who can be there when she needs comfort, who understands that keeping her safe means more than just checking locks and monitoring cameras. Victoria met his eyes. I'll double your previous salary, provide full benefits, and give you flexible hours so you can still be there for Danny. The offer was tempting, but Marc had learned to be cautious. What's changed, Miss Chen? 3 weeks ago, you thought I was a predator who was manipulating your daughter. Victoria's face crumpled. 3 weeks ago, I was terrified that someone else could give Emma something I couldn't. I saw how much she trusted you, how much happier she seemed. And instead of being grateful, I felt threatened. She paused, gathering courage. My father taught me that showing weakness was the fastest way to lose everything. But watching Emma in that hospital bed, I realized that my strength was killing the person I loved most. They went to see Emma together, finding her in a private room decorated with get-well cards from her classmates. She was coloring in a book when they entered, but the moment she saw Marc, she dropped her crayon and burst into tears. You came back, she whispered as he knelt beside her bed. I thought you were gone forever, like Daddy's wife. Marc felt his own eyes fill with tears as he took her small hand. I'm so sorry, Emma. I never wanted to leave you. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they care about. Emma looked between Marc and her mother, her 8-year-old mind trying to process the complex dynamics she'd been caught in. Are you going to stay now? Marc looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. If your mom is okay with it, I'd like to be your friend again. But this time, no secrets. Your mom knows about our lullabies, and she wants to be part of helping you feel safe. That evening, Marc sang Emma to sleep in her hospital room, while Victoria sat nearby, listening to the melody that had comforted her daughter through the darkest nights. When Emma's breathing grew deep and even, Victoria approached the bed and, for the first time in years, kissed her daughter's forehead. Thank you, she whispered to Markham, for teaching me what she needed. 6 months later, Emma's nightmares had become rare visitors instead of nightly tormentors. Victoria had restructured her travel schedule, turning down deals that would keep her away from home for extended periods. And Markham had found a new kind of purpose, protecting not just Emma's physical safety, but nurturing the trust that allowed an 8-year-old girl to believe in the possibility of peaceful sleep. On quiet evenings, when Emma practiced her lullabies and Danny shared stories about his day at school, Markham marveled at how catastrophe had led to healing, how the breaking point had become the beginning of something better for all of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.